It is such a perilous threat that it is almost impossible to imagine, let alone describe. When the 5G signature goes live, it will tap into a multitude of satellites which are in geosat orbit around the surface of the Earth. Millions of surface antennas will pick up that signaling and will then scatter the signaling into hundreds and hundreds of millions of different micro antenna systems set up on street lamps and even in your home, which you're not aware of incidentally. This is stealth technology. This is invisible science. But what it means in simple terms is that you will be flagged up, visible, trackable inside your own home. Anywhere you move on the surface of the Earth, they will have a lock and load tracking capability over you. You will be visible to invisible masters, each one of us, all the time. Today, our governments and the corporate sector have managed somehow to infiltrate the mainframe of our civilization and are pushing through a $20 trillion infrastructural rollout without any, and I mean without any, health science running behind it. There have been no tests. Your government and your health authorities are either in collusion on this matter of genocide and ecocide, or they're just damned stupid, and I would suggest it is the latter.
Hi, my name's Derek Brose. For the last 8 years, I've worked as a freelance investigative journalist based in Houston, Texas. Since 2012, I've covered a wide range of topics, from indigenous resistance at Standing Rock, to corporate and government surveillance, to covering important trials like Chelsea Manning's sentencing and the Silk Road trial. Throughout this time, I've realized that choosing to investigate certain topics will often get you labeled as a conspiracy theorist, or at the very least, a proponent of less than credible journalism, aka fake news. One of these forbidden topics relates to the potential harm caused by cell phones and other digital technology. Over the years, I've seen articles discussing the dangers of radio frequency radiation and electromagnetic fields. Again, I noticed that these studies never made the mainstream headlines or the 24-hour cable news cycle. And even if the news had reported on this information, would it have made a difference? I, like millions of other people around the world, never gave a second thought that cell phones and laptops could be causing harm to human health. We assume that the government agencies responsible for testing these fields have tested everything for safety. I started to wonder, has this blind faith in authority been a huge mistake? My ignorance on these topics came to an end in September 2018 when I learned that the city of Houston had recently partnered with Microsoft and Verizon to turn Houston into a smart city. This smart city would use emerging 5G technology to power the so-called Internet of Things, which in turn will allow for driverless vehicles, robot assistants, artificial intelligence, sensors in the street to moderate streetlights and environmental warning systems, and many other futuristic technologies that we have been promised. And at this time, I had very little understanding of what exactly 5G was, but my preliminary research had shown me that there were an increasing amount of people asking questions about the health and privacy concerns. I also learned that there were lawsuits taking place across Texas and around the world as the opposition to 5G pushed back against the federal government and the wireless industry seizing power from towns, cities, and states. When it comes to cell phones, a new generation of cellular standards has appeared approximately every 10 years since 1G systems were first introduced in 1979. Each new generation is characterized by new frequency bands, higher data rates, and non-backwards compatible transmission technology. The second generation, or 2G, featured cell phones with texting and pictures. The third generation came about around 2000 with the introduction of phones with some internet, video, and images. The fourth generation came around 2009 with the introduction of smartphones and instant streaming of video, as well as the use of apps. As we move into 2020, the shift to the fifth generation, or 5G, has already begun. In addition to being promoted as the solution to 4K movie downloads, the new technology is expected to herald the beginning of smart cities, where driverless cars, traffic lights, pollution sensors, smartphones, and countless other smart devices interact in what is known as the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things, or IoT, is a fancy way to say that we will be surrounded by hundreds of thousands of interconnected devices and sensors which are gathering mass amounts of data that will be used to show you advertising, monitor your habits, and other uses that we can't even predict yet. The switch from 4G to 5G is a change unlike those of previous generations. One notable difference is that 5G technology uses much higher frequencies ranging from 10 to 300 gigahertz. 5G is using millimeter waves, which are easily blocked and do not travel far. The 5G rollout means the installation of hundreds of thousands of new cell sites, towers, and additions to existing infrastructure. Cities like Houston, Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Denver, San Diego, New York, and Washington, D.C. have already begun to deploy 5G for residential and commercial uses. Let's take a moment to examine some of the concerns around 5G and EMFs in general. Chapter 2. The concerns around EMFs and 5G. Over the years, I've come across articles claiming that cell phones were giving people cancer or making them sick. I didn't pay too much attention at first, but when I finally decided to investigate the topic, I realized that there is ample evidence that the technology we are so hurriedly surrounding ourselves with might be putting our lives at risk in more ways than one.
While natural light is also a part of this EMF spectrum, it's in the middle of the spectrum. The upper scale, or the ionizing EMFs, are where you're going to find the kind of radiation that most of us are familiar with being called radiation, like X-rays, gamma rays, things like that. But the lower fields, the radio fields, and specifically the microwave wavelengths are what we're going to be discussing today. So your phone is a two-way communication device that uses non-ionizing microwave radiation to move the data. So just as do iPads, cell phones, Wi-Fi, anything smart, which really only means wireless. So these microwaves, or non-ionizing, are, especially in America, generally thought to be safe, in contrast to the ionizing radiation, which is pretty well known by now to be capable of causing cancer and damage. Which is why your dentist put that really heavy lead vest over you whenever he is x-raying your teeth. It's to protect your body from needless exposure to the x-rays, which they know can break your DNA. What your grandparents or parents may remember is that these x-rays were not always known to be harmful. They may remember, like my parents do, when shoe stores had x-ray machines in them called fluoroscopes. They would be sitting out in the lobby for the public to use freely. Apparently kids love them. My mom said that they would run to the shoe store just to stick their feet in this machine and watch their bones wiggle inside these shoes. Wow, creepy. But most doctors in the 50s said that the recreational use of these fluoroscopes was being brushed off as just fine. It was not harmful. The shoe-fitting fluoroscope is not an instrument with obviously hazardous potentialities. It has long been used and no direct clinical evidence of harm has yet been established. So said Dr. Leon Lewis in 1950. Given that, let's keep in mind that our government-backed scientists and agencies have had a tendency to assure the public that many things were safe, only to find out quite the opposite. Think cigarettes.
Doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?"
Think DDT.
It begins with the war-born development of DDT. This diabolical weapon of modern science saved millions of humans, but killed billions of insects. Man, with this newly discovered force, has at long last gained the upper hand in our age-old struggle. But the really sure kill feature of this insect killer isn't simply that it contains DDT, it's the way that it makes sure that bugs get the DDT that's in it.
Think Agent Orange, think lead, think asbestos, the list goes on and on. So it's easy to see with hindsight this commercial as absurd.
Any other cigarette. See how camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good tasting a cigarette can be.
But I want to know what kind of products are being sold to us now that will down the road be proven to be incredibly dangerous.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the National Press Club Federal Communications Commission Chairman Tom Wheeler.
It's an honor to be here at the National Press Club. The first generation wireless, 1G, was voice. The second generation, 2G, allowed both talk and text. The third generation, 3G, the internet, in a limited way. And today's technology, 4G, completed that digital migration. But if anyone tells you that they know the details of what 5G is going to become, run the other way. Yes, 5G will connect the Internet of everything. If something can be connected, it will be connected in a 5G world. Hundreds of billions of microchips connected in products from pill bottles to plant waterers, requiring massive deployment of small cells. We won't wait for the standards. Now, to make this work, the 5G build-out is going to be very infrastructure intensive. We must reject the notion that the 5G future will be the sole provenance of urban areas. The 5G revolution will touch all corners, and that's damn important. The interconnected world of the future will be the result of decisions we must make today.
The main issue before us today is Senate Bill 637 and Senate Bill 894, the former by Senator Hugh and the latter by Senator Knopf. We're going to invite the first four witnesses in support of the legislation, and that would be John Jones with Sprint, David Lewis and Andy Emerson with AT&T, Neil Krevda with Verizon, and Frank Iacovetti Jr. with T-Mobile.
So be straight with me. Is it true?
It could be.
No, well, very few cases. There was an unfortunate incident out in Iowa. Look, gentlemen, practice these words in front of the mirror. Although we are constantly exploring the subject, currently, there is no direct evidence that links cell phone usage to brain cancer.
I'm Sharon Goldberg. I'm an internal medicine physician. I've practiced medicine for 21 years, and my background is mostly academic, internal medicine, hospital-based, clinical research, and medical education.
I'm a certified Microsoft small business specialist. I worked on space station designing the cabling system for the airlock module, where I was responsible for EMI/EMC analysis, which is electromagnetic interference, electromagnetic compatibility.
I am a professor in the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Occupational Health, and I teach there both toxicology and health effects of electromagnetic radiation.
My name is Daphne Tachover, and I'm the founder of an organization called We Are the Evidence. We are an organization that represents the many adults and unfortunately many children who have become very sick from wireless technology radiation.
There seems to be a couple false Easter eggs being put out there right now. I want to make sure we dispel that right off the gate.
The effects of wireless on health scientifically are very, very clear.
So it's always pushed back to the definition of an acceptable level of radiation. And that's what this is, by the way. This is about radiation.
Wireless radiation has biological effects, period.
My name is Dr. Angie Kolbeck. I've been reviewing the studies showing the impacts of wireless radiation on our health, and there are now thousands of studies showing the following adverse health impacts to wireless radiation: cancer, oxidative damage, DNA damage, DNA failure.
Things like memory, dizziness, anxiety, brain fog.
Headaches, nosebleeds, cognitive problem, exhaustion.
We have evidence of DNA damage, cardiomyopathy, which is the precursor of congestive heart failure.
Short and long-term memory loss, decreased attention spans, lower reaction times, even involuntary contractions of muscles causing misalignments of spines and jaws.
Breast cancer. We suddenly have breast cancer in women who have no DNA predisposition.
Disrupted immune function and change in stress proteins, reproductive and fertility effects.
There are dozens and dozens of studies that show beyond any doubt what this radiation is doing to our sperm. Now, if you take the cell phone out of your pocket, the sperm will recuperate within 3 to 4 months. What would not recuperate would be the damage to the DNA of the sperm. That is irreparable. The wife of the ex-governor of Indiana was diagnosed with glioblastoma. Same brain tumor Ted Kennedy had and John McCain had. Did you look at John McCain's car? This is a cell phone brain tumor. LeBron James, one of our sports people, had a salivary gland tumor. That is another cell phone tumor. You didn't hear about it because immediately after that was discovered, he was paid by Samsung to become their spokesperson.
We are seeing increases in brain tumors. We're seeing increases in Alzheimer's. We're seeing increases in all of the neurotransmitter diseases, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson's. These are all disease systems that are known to be associated with low-level energy exposures.
We talk about 24/7, around-the-clock exposure, wherever you are and your whole body. You never get away from it. And it seems from our studies that maybe your immune system can cope with for a time, but it will deteriorate. Then the irradiation will definitely damage cells at a deeper level, and the question is what will then happen?
These are out of peer-reviewed papers, so these are not just hypochondriacs thinking that they're doing it. We're having real problems with this.
This is no longer a subject for debate when you look at PubMed and the peer-reviewed literature. These effects are seen in all life forms: plants, animals, insects, microbes. So 5G is not a conversation about whether or not these biological effects exist. They clearly do.
There is scientifically evidence that is so strong that you can be certain that the standards used by the FCC to manage health effects are wrong.
We need to start measuring how much radiation are people being exposed to before we roll out 5G. There are 4 kinds of electromagnetic fields that we know are harmful to human health. So radio frequency radiation, magnetic fields, dirty electricity, and electric fields, okay? Our exposure, any given person, and all humans are affected by EMFs. What is our exposure in a day? It's not one cell phone. It's cell phones, it's multiple wireless networks, it's smart meters, it's cell towers. It's this sandwich, and it all adds up.
The data we're going to look at are all published science, testing results, or public standards. At the bottom end of the radiation scale of what's called power density, or signal strength, is the minimum level at which cell phones will work, which was found to be 0.2 billionths of a microwatt per centimeter squared. Pine needles were found to age prematurely at 0.000027. At short-term exposures of 0.05, children aged 8 to 17 experienced headache, irritation, concentration difficulties, and behavioral problems. 0.1 is the biobiology or building biology guideline for extreme concern. 1.0 produced sperm DNA fragmentation and a decrease in sperm viability in vitro. Also at 1.0, the science shows the following bodily effects can occur: headaches, dizziness, fatigue, insomnia, chest pain, difficulty breathing, and indigestion. 2.5 saw altered calcium metabolism in heart muscle cells. 4.0, changes in the hippocampus affecting brain memory and learning. And at 6.0, DNA damage in cells. So where are smart meters on this list? Electrical Power Institute in December 2010 measured a single Itron smart meter with pulses up to 7.93 microwatts per centimeter squared. Our own testing indicated approximately 8.0 with 1 meter. These tests are at a close distance, approximately 1 foot away from the meter, but an infant's crib could be just as close on the other side of the wall where the meter or bank of meters are installed. Even though there are all these known health effects at levels far lower, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Luxembourg see fit to set the standard at 9.5. And China, Poland, and Russia, 10.0. This is the same level at which behavior has been altered, producing reflexes of avoidance following 30-minute exposures. A room of 12 smart meters, very common and even a conservative number in an apartment building, tested at 19.8 microwatts per centimeter squared. This is hundreds of times higher than levels which clearly indicate harmful effects. So how can utilities and governments get away with forcing these devices on everyone? This is how. In Canada and the US and several other civilized countries, the safety limit is set at 600 to 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared. This so-called safety limit is literally tens of thousands of times higher than levels which are known to damage health according to peer-reviewed published science.
faster, better, more reliable internet. That's the promise of 5G technology, but there is also the peril. Health hazards associated with radio frequency that is higher also and requires more transmitters and antennas. And the stark, simple fact is the health hazards are unknown and unstudied. And that is a sign of neglect and disregard on the part of the Federal Communications Commission that seems unacceptable. There have been no answers so far. The FCC basically has said everything's fine, but in order to reach a conclusion about the health and safety of this new technology, we need facts.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this hearing. 5G, as you well know, also uses higher frequency waves that don't travel as far and will rely on a network of hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of small cell sites. And the question then is, are there any health implications, any public safety implications to those additional sites that are likely to be located close to homes, schools, workplaces, and closer to the ground? Correct?
Correct, Senator. Yes.
So my question for you, particularly Mr. Gillen and Mr. Perry, how much money has the industry committed to supporting additional independent research? I stress independent research. Is that independent research ongoing? Has any been completed? Where can consumers look for it? And we're talking about research on the biological effects of this new technology.
Thank you, Senator. I think, thank you for your focus on the issue. Safety is paramount, and as you alluded to, we rely on the expert agencies, we rely on the findings of the FDA and others as to the requirements to keep all of us safe. There are no industry-backed studies, to my knowledge right now. Happy to visit with you as to what opportunities you think there needs to be more studies, and we're always for more science. We also rely on what the scientists tell us.
So essentially, the answer to my question, how much money? Zero.
I can certainly follow up with you, Senator. To my knowledge, there's no active studies being backed by industry today.
Anybody else know of industry commitments to back research, fund it, support it, to ascertain scientifically the health effect?
No, I'm not aware of any.
So there really is no research ongoing. We're kind of flying blind here, so far as health and safety is concerned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're a trained medical professional.
Yes.
We don't have one on the panel. What are we to make with of the American Cancer Society, for example, telling us there's no evidence of harmful product?
Many of these organizations have conflicts of interest.
Very briefly, if you can, what do you mean by conflict of interest?
One of the first things that you teach residents is that you always have to look at the funding.
There's a tremendous amount of sponsored research by people who are hired to do studies to find no effect. And that's plagued this field in a number of countries.
The radio frequency radiation work that we did was supported by Motorola. The relationship was really very cordial and very stress-free, but only up until we started generating data. These folks were very, very upset and began to talk about how are they going to handle this, what sort of spin can we put on this, what can we expect from this, and from that point on the relationship changed. What we saw was that Motorola began to exert more and more control over the work, telling us what to do, telling us how to write abstracts, what to say in the abstracts, what to say in the papers, how to do the work. No, don't do this. Yes, do it this way. This was unacceptable. I had completed our study of DNA damage, and I submitted the final report to Motorola. They simply weren't willing to accept my interpretation of my study, my evaluation of my study, my knowledge of science at that point, and tried to urge me not to publish the study.
Did you hear about people coming to you as far as having complaints about illness?
We were made aware of health complaints following installation of smart meters, and we wanted to verify this using our field work. So I measured the field of about 30 different people while they stood 1 foot in front of the smart meter, and in every single case, the human energy field was obliterated as they stood in front of the smart meter. So in our first slides, what we see is normal cells, and the structure of the cells is intact and sound. This is what we would expect from a normal sample. So after 2 minutes of exposure in front of the smart meter at about 1 foot away, we see a totally different story. Sample 1, you can see a lot of degradation in the cells. The cell walls have been broken, and you see changes in the cells which are called mycoplasma. It shows a mutation to the cell. In the second sample, we see a different type of degradation to the cell membranes. You can see a corrugation here. This is called bottle cap formation, and it's known that this occurs due to oxidation or exposure to free radicals. So this third subject, when we did her sample, she had to be pulled away from the meter after 45 seconds because she complained about an increasingly severe headache. And here you see a phenomenon called rouleau, where the red blood cells are stacking up, which makes it very difficult for the blood to deliver oxygen to the tissues as they would be their normal function. Every single one of these is a degradation. Every single one of these shows a trauma to the blood cells, and that came from something, and the only variable was the smart meter. The good news in all this is the patient and the blood can return to normal once they have been removed from the influences of these stressors.
Martin Paul says, putting tens of millions of 5G antennas without a single biological test of safety has to be about the stupidest idea anyone has had in the history of the world. So assessing all this, we have experts in various fields: military EMF weaponry, biological effects on humans, firefighters that are getting cognitive impairment by being there in them, countries that are banning these sort of technologies around schools because of the impairment to cognitive. Let's weigh that up in light of what Rudolf Steiner said in 1924 about just mere radio causing the impairment of cognitive functions on people, that they can receive news from around the world, but they can't understand it as well because of the effect of the electricity. We have to say, something smells sinister here.
With the 5th generation, it's actually a whole new ballgame. It's not using the same technology. They're switching to military-grade millimeter wave technology. And when you look at this technology, I mean, if you go and look at DARPA reports, come and look at some of the patents that the United States military has put out on what they can do with psychological weapons, all sorts of things, crowd control, active denial, anything you can think of. This is what they can do with 5G. So any type of military application you can think of which has an electromagnetic base, they can do with 5G. And they're putting this out blanket across the population.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
The FCC is a capture agency. They probably conducted what I believe to be the biggest fraud on the public ever conducted.
The FCC has been described by Harvard University's Center for Ethics writer Norman Alster as the most captured agency in D.C., acting more as a industry cheerleader than a regulator. This is especially true today with 5G, where there are serious safety concerns and potentially misleading information coming from the FCC.
For example, the previous chairman of the FCC is Tom Wheeler. He was the head of the Wireless Lobby Association for 14 years. Now remember, Obama told us there would be no lobbyists in his administration, so he took the biggest lobby and put him as a head of the FCC.
And that's damn important.
In 1993, the FCC started a rulemaking to adopt the IEEE regulations on this issue. IEEE is an engineer association. Why is it that we adopt regulation of engineers who maybe know how to measure this radiation when it's passing a wall, but not when it's passing a body? All our health agencies objected it, saying that it makes no sense to adopt engineer association, that they had not even one biomedical person on their team.
They are effectively indemnified against adverse health impact lawsuits when the acceptable limits are higher than the limits actually shown to show harmful health effects.
The FCC guidelines were developed for short-term exposures, 6 minutes, 30 minutes, depending on it's a phone or an outdoor exposure. And they have absolutely no connection to the biological effects that have been very clearly summarized in the Bio Initiative.
So as you can see, there's a number of individuals in this room today that have serious concerns about this as regards to their health. If one of your companies decides to put one of these small cells up at a pole that's within, say, 50 feet of one of their houses, what recourse do they have to say, is there a way to move it somewhere else?
There's language in the bill so that the authority can require the applicant to come forth with certification of compliance with the FCC's rules related to radio frequency emission.
Remember that denial of request or denial of permit request that you can put in? It's going to point back to the acceptable levels as determined by the FCC. Not the EPA or not the CDC, the ones who usually take care of health concerns, but by the FCC, which is staffed by former members of the telecommunication industry. That's the fox guarding the henhouse.
It's a fact that most insurance companies will not indemnify against EMF effects. Telecom companies around the world are warning their investors of potential major costs due to real or alleged risks of EMF pollution from their products. Interestingly enough, they're warning their investors, but they're not telling their customers. They're basically keeping it quiet because that's where their money comes from. So we're using technology that could be very potentially harmful to us, and the investors know it. But their only worry is that they might lose money, not that our health might be affected.
First of all, I think what you should really think about is why is it that they're not insured? It's not that they chose to be self-insured. They're actually rejected by the insurance company from being insured because they understand the risk. And
so the insurance companies, the big insurance companies, will not insure the telecommunications?
So there's insurance companies, and then there's what's called secondary insurance companies. Secondary insurance companies are the insurance companies that insure the insurance companies. So in an event, an insurance company, let's say I insure Verizon, and it may not be able to meet the claims, then the secondary insurance company is kicking in.
Like Lloyd's of London.
Sorry?
Like
Yes,
Lloyd's of
exactly.
London.
So two leading ones would be Lloyd's of London and Swiss Re. Both told the insurance company not to insure the wireless industry, and this is why they're not insured. And that should give you a hint. Now, this is exactly why they have to prevent a lawsuit. And how did they prevent lawsuit? That goes back to Section 704. Section 704 was passed in 1996. This is how our rights in regards to health were taken away by the wireless industry. What this legislation did, it gave the power to regulate the health effects of wireless technology to the FCC. FCC is a spectrum auctioning agency. It's not a health agency. They don't even have one biomedical person on their team. And then the other thing that Section 704 did, it actually took the power from the states to regulate location of cell towers based on health. And what does it mean? It means that if they want to put a cell tower in front of your home, you cannot go to your city council and say, hey, stop, I don't want it. I just heard in a lecture that there are 10,000 studies proving that it's harmful. I don't want it. My child is sick. They would tell you, stop. You're not allowed to mention this in the city council because Section 704 says that if you will, and if the application will be rejected, the city will be sued, can be sued by the wireless industry.
A major U.S. government study on rats finds a link between cell phones and cancer.
Very first government study linking the radiation from cell phones to cancer.
2-decade, $30 million federal study out today found there is some evidence of a link between cell phone radiation and brain cancer.
Professor, what is the NDP? I've heard that study several times. NDP is what?
So it's a $25 million study on the rats and mice that was supposed to demonstrate that there were no effects of radiation below thermal. And in fact, it demonstrated exactly the opposite. And it follows on the heels of two major studies on animals that said exactly the same thing.
And that study was designed perfectly to make sure that it cannot be challenged, that there will not be any doubt. That's why it took them 14 years. That's how they prevented discussion of health. And why do they want to prevent discussion of health if there's no problem with health?
Simply put, FCC is completely unprepared, unable, and possibly unwilling to oversee 5G for safety, even as it barrels toward us. They are falling back on tired definitions and panaceas long since disproven by science. To make matters worse, recent FCC rulings and numerous industry-friendly bills passed at state and federal levels between 2016 and 2018 removed the last vestiges of local and state review over infrastructure siting, just when we need it the most.
The fifth generation of wireless technology, or 5G as it's being rolled out worldwide without safety testing. Let me say that again, without safety testing. And how we've got scientists and doctors and environmental organizers saying, stop this. Because in terms of the effects of wireless radiation, the science is in. Wireless radiation can lead to cancerous heart tumors, brain tumors, DNA damage. Wireless radiation is linked to infertility, to autism, Alzheimer's, and more. And guess what? All the effects that I just listed, those are some of the effects that are known according to the technology that's being seen today.
First of all, you have to know that we know that the other EMFs that we're exposed to are already known to be health risks. And basically that 5G, because of the frequency that's going to be used and because of the extraordinarily high pulsation levels that will be used, is a much bigger threat to our health than the things that we already have, which are very substantial threats to our health. We're not just talking about the intensity. We're talking about the frequency and the very high level of pulsations. There's a huge literature which shows that pulsed EMFs, EMFs that pulse up and down very rapidly, are in most cases much more biologically active than our non-pulsed EMFs. Every single wireless communication device communicates via pulsations, but the industry completely ignores this issue. The problem with 5G is that they're planning to put out tens of millions of these antennae all over the place without doing one single biological safety test.
Are you implying possibly that we, the consumers, are the guinea pigs since they haven't really done tests to see the effects in a smaller setting?
I mean, that's not an implication, it's a statement. We are, yes.
Cancer is not the main concern that I have. I'm really concerned about sperm count and about effects on pregnancy.
How many of you know that 1 in 6 American couples is unable to have a child when they want to? How many of you know that last year the birth rate in this country dropped the most that it ever has in recent history 3% in a single year.
People look at the sperm, and people use cell phones, and the sperm, usually sperm swim, and they swim straight. But if you expose them to radio frequency, mobile phone waves, they swim in a circle.
Studies have been done here in Australia, taking sperm from healthy men. And one test tube gets exposed to cell phone radiation, and one test tube is not exposed to mobile phone radiation. And then the results are evaluated. And this is a measure of vitality. We measure how well the sperm swim. This is a measure of motility. This is a measure of mitochondrial DNA damage. They have 3 times as much damage on their DNA if they have been exposed to mobile phone radiation. The data on that are rock solid. Cell phones can damage sperm quantity and quality.
The real damage here is your grandchildren. That is where it is going to show most.
Do you think that there is a chance that within the 3rd generation of females, they may be irreversibly sterile?
Not in the 3rd generation, but in the 5th generation, and that would for humans be something in the order of 150 years ahead of us. And of course, then it's too late to say that you are sorry, and it's very too late to say stop. There is a wealth of papers. I mean, we're talking about thousands of published papers in the scientific literature, few of which, or sometimes none of which, have entered the official documentations from authorities and likewise. So I think it's really time to have an independent compilation of data. Such was done at August 31st, 2007 in the form of the Bioinitiative report, of which I was one of the authors. And then we put together approximately 2,000 scientific references on a little bit more than 600 pages, clearly saying that if you, for instance, if you are a rat or a mouse or a cell or a molecule, you should definitely not allow yourself to be exposed to this. And in the meantime, we have this full-scale experiment using our own kids.
One interesting case, John Patterson, he was a telecommunications engineer in Sydney, Australia. Very brilliant man.
For 20 years, John tested Telstra digital systems. Over the time, he realised the dangers of electromagnetic radiation.
It disrupts the bioelectric system of your body, which is really your brain, your nervous system, how your muscles talk.
And he tried warning of these effects through different agencies, through his company.
Got all the test gear out and measured it and drew up a report, and I was immediately removed from service.
Finally, in 2007, he took matters into his own hand. He commandeered a used British Army tank and went and destroyed 6 cell phone towers in Sydney, Australia, because he wanted to stop this. He was trying to make a point.
The message was that how dangerous it was.
You know, these people were elected by us to manage our infrastructure in a responsible manner. That is the sole purpose of government if it's going to exist at all. And if it doesn't do that, then it has no right. It is invalid. So we need to pull this infrastructure down. We really do. But in order to do that, I mean, we can't just be some violent domestic terrorist. You've got to bring this awareness to the people that these towers are doing them damage. You don't need bandwidth that fast. And they're not doing it so you can download movies quickly. They're doing it so they can track every single thing you do and bring in this social crediting system to control even everything you think.
Current public exposure levels are at least 1 quintillion, that's 18 zeros, 1 quintillion times above natural background radiation, according to Professor Olle Johansson of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. The highly dangerous biological effects of EMFs have been documented by thousands of studies since 1932, indicating that we may be facing a global health catastrophe orders of magnitude worse than those caused by tobacco and cigarettes. 5G is designed to deliver concentrated and focused electromagnetic radiation in excess of 100 times current levels in the same way as do directed energy weapons. There is currently an international appeal signed by 237 EMF scientists from 41 nations urging the UN and particularly the WHO to exert strong leadership in fostering the development of more protective EMF guidelines, encouraging precautionary measures and educating the public about the considerable health risks, particularly the risks to children and fetal development.
Sorry, because we are talking with someone that is a little bit ignorant on these things. If you're talking to the Wi-Fi systems, I become worried because I put those devices in my house. I will have to, I confess my ignorance on this. We will have to, but I'm going to raise this with WHO, which I think is the organization that might be able to deal with it properly, because I must confess I was not aware of that danger.
In 1996, when the Telecommunications Act was passed, in it was a provision essentially that kept local officials from addressing health issue concerns when approving or not approving a cell tower. So
that's correct.
But then something new is happening. We've talked a lot about it on the Solari report, thanks to Jason Bowden-Smith and his website EMF Warriors. But this is new. This is very, very new. So you're basically, sending out an appeal on something that in one sense hasn't happened yet. This is not just an incremental change. This is a big step up.
It's a sea change. An onslaught's not an improper word. It's a bombardment. So instead of a cell tower 1 mile or 2 miles from you and you still have cell phone service, we're going to have antennas every block, and some poor soul is going to have one mounted to a utility pole maybe less than 20 meters from their home. So this kind of, invasive bombardment with this many antennas, just in 1 square mile, if you do the math, 1 per block and 16 blocks per mile, that's about 250 antennas per square mile. The millimeter wave is untested. Former FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler openly said that they don't plan to test.
We won't wait for the standards.
And then our appeal also addresses the fact that there's a plan to roll out 5G through satellites in low Earth orbit. So 20,000 satellites, which will cover every square foot of the planet with a 5G signal.
5G uses the frequency of 24 gigahertz. Gigahertz is a unit of measurement along this larger electromagnetic spectrum. You know all about this. You're familiar with this. AM radio waves, FM radio waves. There's cell phones and Wi-Fi. You get into the higher wavelengths, you get into things like TV remotes, visible light, medical x-rays, so on and so forth. So you're probably saying at this point, but what does that have to do with the weather, right? We've got these satellites up in orbit around the Earth, and those satellites pick up on different frequencies. Satellites, though, see atmospheric water vapor at 23.8 gigahertz. So if you've got that 5G signal emitting out a signal at 24 gigahertz, then our water vapor is at 23.8 gigahertz, that's really close to each other on that larger spectrum. So if the satellites are looking down to Earth, they're going to get confused. Is it the 5G signal? Is it water vapor? Ultimately, we're not going to be able to determine that. And that data that's used for forecast models is taken right from those satellites. If we can't use that data, those forecasts are going to get worse.
Due to their concerns, NASA and NOAA were seeking a sizable buffer zone between the frequency bands used for weather and those used for 5G. This buffer is measured in units of decibel watts. Unfortunately, in late November 2019, at a meeting of the International Telecommunication Union, international regulators agreed to a buffer of 33 decibel watts until September 1st, 2027, and a 39 decibel watt limit after that. The goal was to allow 5G companies to start building networks now and to add more protection for weather forecasting once the companies have established their networks.
The U.S. has been slow to get into the game, but the president said the FCC would work to make it easier for companies to do so. That includes freeing up high-frequency airwaves or spectrum to carry 5G. And the FCC plans to spend $20 billion over 10 years on expanding 5G broadband for rural communities.
Erica Leix, a meteorologist and head of World Meteorological Organization, called the idea of having 8 years of lax regulation of grave concern to weather forecasters. Once again, regulators chose policies that benefit big wireless and failed to protect the planet and the people. The 5G expansion not only poses a threat to human health, privacy, and weather forecasting, but an increasing amount of research indicates that surrounding ourselves with an unprecedented amount of digital devices is creating a new form of pollution known as a digital or electrosmog. In the report, Bees, Birds, and Mankind, German researchers discussed the effects of this electric smog. Quote, "The consequences of this development have also been predicted by the critics for many decades and can now no longer be ignored. Bees and other insects disappear, birds avoid certain areas, and are disoriented in other locations." In September 2008, Dr. Ulrich Warnke, one of the authors of that report, also presented his findings to the Radiation Research Trust at the Royal Society in London. He stated that, quote, "An unprecedented dense mesh of artificial magnetic, electrical, and electromagnetic fields are disrupting nature on a massive scale, causing birds and bees to lose their bearings, fail to reproduce, and die." A review of studies from around the world shows that concerns around the electrosmog are rising. One study reviewed the impact of radio frequency radiation from wireless telecommunications on wildlife. The researchers note that phone towers located in the living areas of some species are continuously irradiating wildlife, causing a reduction of their natural defenses, deterioration of their health, and problems in reproduction. The researchers conclude that, quote, "Microwave and radio frequency pollution constitutes a potential cause for the decline of animal populations and deteriorations of health of plants living near phone masts. To measure these effects, urgent specific studies are necessary." Studies are also beginning to look at the impacts of radio frequency radiation on trees. A 2016 study attempted to verify whether there is a connection between unusual tree damage and radio frequency exposure. The researchers conducted a long-term field monitoring study in 2 German cities. They observed and took photos of unusual or unexplainable tree damage, along with measurements of electromagnetic radiation. A statistical analysis showed that electromagnetic radiation from cell phone towers is harmful for trees. The researchers note that, quote, "These results are consistent with the fact that damage inflicted on trees by mobile phone towers usually starts on one side, extending to the whole tree over time." A 2010 study looked at the decline in aspen trees in Colorado since 2004. This study suggested that the radio frequency exposure may have strong adverse effects on growth rate and may be an underlying factor in aspen decline. Additionally, there are concerns that thousands of trees will be cut down or trimmed to ensure the 5G frequencies operate efficiently. Another area of growing concern relates to the fear that the massive increase in exposure to radio frequency radiation could be one of the causes for bee colony collapse disorder, which has wreaked havoc on the global honeybee population. In a 2017 study, researcher Daniel Favre of Switzerland claims that his article describes an experiment on bees which clearly shows the adverse effects of electromagnetic fields on their behavior. Favre states that, quote, "The experiment should be reproduced by other researchers so that the danger of man-made electromagnetism for bees, nature, and thus humans ultimately appears evident to anyone." In the study, Mobile Phone Mast Effects on Common Frog Tadpoles, researchers exposed eggs and tadpoles to electromagnetic radiation from cell phone antennas for 2 months, from the egg phase until an advanced phase of tadpole, and found low coordination of movements, an inconsistent growth pattern, and a high mortality rate. The authors conclude, quote, "These results indicate that radiation emitted by phone masts in a real situation may affect the development and may cause an increase in mortality of exposed tadpoles. This research may have huge implications for the natural world, which is now exposed to high microwave radiation levels from a multitude of phone masts."
Ajit Pai is the chair of the FCC, and he joins me now. Welcome to the NewsHour.
Thank you for having me on.
So I want to ask you about what one of your Democratic colleagues on the FCC had to say about our efforts to get into 5G. She said, so far we've done more harm than good. She cites the president's tariffs on 5G equipment, says the White House has been alienating security allies. We need to expand that network. How do those things hamper your ability to build and grow the network?
I respectfully disagree. If you look at some of the independent observers, they believe that the United States is in the lead when it comes to 5G. For example, Cisco recently put out a report suggesting that North America, led of course by the United States, would have twice as many 5G connections as Asia by 2022. That same month, ABI Research said flatly that the United States is in the lead in 5G. Over last week, CTIA pointed out that the United States will have 92 deployments of 5G in the United States by the end of 2019, which is almost twice as many as any country in the world. And just on Tuesday, a report came out that was reported in Bloomberg, pointing out that 5G-related job listings in the United States have increased 12% just over the last 3 weeks. So these are objective indicia of the fact that we are in the lead in 5G, but we want to maintain that lead, and that's part of the reason why I was at the White House today to announce 2 new initiatives.
Well, deployment is one thing, but consumer...
But to those willing to do the homework, it becomes clear. There is ample evidence of negative impacts as a result of radio frequency radiation associated with cell phones, Wi-Fi, and likely 5G. In fact, in 2018, the European Commission's Scientific Committee on Health, Environmental, and Emerging Risks released a statement on emerging health and environmental issues, which clearly outlined the need for more independent research. Under Section 4.4, Potential Effects on Wildlife of Increases in Electromagnetic Radiation, the report states, quote, "How exposure to electromagnetic fields could affect humans remains a controversial area, and studies have not yet yielded clear evidence of the impact on mammals, birds, or insects. The lack of clear evidence to inform the development of exposure guidelines to 5G technology leaves open the possibility of unintended biological consequences. These unintended consequences have the potential to affect human life as well as insects, birds, plants, and trees." Chapter 3: The Big Wireless 5G Takeover. As I continued my research and began presenting it to City Council and fellow Houstonians, I noticed there was often a reluctance to believe what I was claiming. Several times, I was asked something along the lines of, "How could something so dangerous be allowed on the market? Doesn't the government regulate this technology?" Once again, the trust of the authorities made people feel like they were safe from harm. Unfortunately, the research shows otherwise. But how could this happen? How can the U.S. government allow potentially hazardous products to be sold and used by millions of people? To understand this, we need to go back to 1996. That year, the Telecommunications Act was passed as an effort to update the law around communications technology as the internet was beginning to come into mass public use. The act was also seen as a way to limit the growing AT&T monopoly. Unfortunately, it was the beginning of further consolidation of telecommunications companies and a huge step towards eroding local power. The 1996 Act prohibits local jurisdictions from considering perceived health effects when taking an action on a proposed facility, such as towers or small cells. Instead, cities and towns could only regulate cell sites based on the aesthetics and location of the devices. Quote, "No state or local government or instrumentality thereof may regulate the placement, construction, and modification of personal wireless service facilities on the basis of the environmental effects of radio frequency emissions to the extent that such facilities comply with the Commission's regulations concerning such emissions. As long as the facilities comply with the standards set by the FCC, they cannot be subjected to environmental or health regulations." But what happens if those federal standards set by the FCC in 1996 are not adequate? As we will get into shortly, there are studies which show health effects even at the levels allowed by the 1996 Telecommunications Act, not to mention the fact that the standards are over 2 decades old and based on outdated technology. Not only was the Telecom Act designed to protect the profits of the big wireless companies, but somewhere along the way, the FCC and the telecoms developed an incestuous relationship that has overtaken the voices and concerns of the American people. In 2015, the Harvard Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics published an exposé by investigative journalist Norm Alster on the financial ties between the US FCC and how, as a result, the wireless industry has bought unfettered access to and power over a major US regulatory agency. The report details how the FCC, an independent government agency created in 1934 to regulate interstate communications by radio, TV, wire, satellite, and cable, has become a captured agency with big wireless leaders filling the government seats in a revolving door fashion. Regarding the passing of the 1996 Telecom Act, Alster writes that, quote, "Late lobbying won the wireless industry enormous concessions from lawmakers, many of them major recipients of industry hard and soft dollar contributions. Congressional staffers who helped lobbyists write the new law did not go unrewarded. 13 of 15 staffers later became lobbyists themselves." Alster states that direct lobbying by industry is just one of many worms in a rotting apple. The report says the FCC is involved in a network of powerful moneyed interests with limitless access and a variety of ways to shape policy. Alster believes the worst part is that the wireless industry has been allowed to grow unchecked and virtually unregulated, with fundamental questions on public health routinely ignored. Unfortunately, the situation goes beyond corrupt government agencies and into actually defaming those who speak out against potential harms caused by wireless technology. Think about that for a moment. An international corporation trying to exert pressure on scientists who draw conclusions that their product is causing harm to human health. Even further, Dr. Lai's experiments show negative health consequences at levels considered safe by the FCC. The captured agency report makes it clear that this type of corruption takes place because of the, quote, free flow of executive leadership between the FCC and the industries it presumably oversees. For example, at the time of the report's release, the chairman of the FCC was Tom Wheeler, a man with deep ties to the big wireless industry. In 2013, Wheeler was nominated as FCC chairman by Obama after raising more than $700,000 for Obama's presidential campaigns.
And that's because for more than 30 years, Tom's been at the forefront of some of the very dramatic changes that we've seen in the way we communicate and how we live our lives.
Wheeler led the two most powerful industry lobbying groups, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association and the Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association, or the CTIA. The current chairman of the FCC could also be seen as another example of a captured agency in action. Ajit Pai, a lawyer and current chairman of the FCC, served as Associate General Counsel at Verizon Communications between 2001 and 2003, where he handled competition and regulatory matters. Pai was appointed to the FCC by Barack Obama in 2012 and then made FCC chairman by Donald Trump in January 2017. So what exactly is the race to 5G? If you've paid attention to any media or visited a cell phone store recently, you've likely heard of the buzz about 5G, and more specifically, the race to 5G. Geopolitically speaking, the race to 5G describes the ongoing rift between the US and China, a kind of digital Cold War where the two superpowers race to implement the next generation of cellular technology because of its potential for massive profit and massive data collection. The American media and President Trump have stated that Chinese company Huawei could use their 5G infrastructure to spy on Americans. Trump has called on federal officials and American companies to abandon Huawei equipment. This fear of Chinese spying using 5G equipment completely ignores the reality that the US government has the same exact opportunity to pressure American companies to spy on the private data of Americans. Despite a number of lawsuits from cities and states, objections from scientists and health professionals, concerns from citizens, politicians, and journalists, the CTIA, the FCC, and Donald Trump continue to push the 5G agenda forward. As I discovered in my research, there are health and privacy concerns around cell phones, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, laptops, and other digital devices. The research shows we should limit our exposure to these devices and find ways to protect our privacy. We should also recognize that the major difference between the 5G smart grid and the current technology is that once 5G rolls out, you will not be able to avoid it. You can choose not to use a cell phone or not install Wi-Fi in your home, but once the 5G network is complete, you will be surrounded by hundreds of thousands of sensors, small cells, and other infrastructure. Once I understood the implications of this, I realized I had to know what I can do to protect myself, my family, and my friends. Chapter 4. Solutions. The reality is that we are already living in the electro-digital smog. The public has excitedly purchased the latest upgrades to their digital technology of choice, from smartphones to laptops, doorbell cameras, public Wi-Fi networks, home assistants, smart houses, and the early stages of 5G. We are inundated with digital technology which emit various levels of radio frequency radiation. Bit by bit, device by device, we are being exposed to an increasing level of radiation, and this cumulative effect has the potential to cause a great amount of harm to the public. Collectively, each of these devices form a digital panopticon, where private companies, law enforcement, governments, and hackers can literally trace your movements from the moment you wake up and interact with your phone throughout your entire day as you move through public spaces and visit your work, family, and friends. If the public doesn't wake up to these dangers and quickly organize a massive global effort to push back against 5G, the smart city future seems inevitable. So what would this pushback look like, and what can we do as individuals? First, the opposition would need to involve ending the relationship between big wireless execs and government officials, as well as an honest discussion about the established dangers posed by our digital world. Organizing political opposition should take place at all levels, but I highly encourage everyone to start getting involved in their local communities and asking about the dangers presented in this documentary. You can join a local group that might be talking about 5G, privacy, health, or the environment, and let them know about these concerns. If there isn't a group already, you can start one. pass out flyers at community festivals, farmers markets, concerts, and political events. You can host educational events at community centers and show this documentary. If your neighborhood has a homeowners association or similar group, you can attempt to fight against the installation of new small cells in your neighborhood. Some activists and concerned homeowners have even filed lawsuits in an attempt to stop the 5G rollout. When it comes to solutions for protecting yourself in the meantime, remember that the National Toxicology Program's 10-year study recommends those concerned about the potential health risks from radiofrequency radiation should, quote, use speaker mode or headset or reduce the amount of time spent using your cell phone. Simply put, limiting your use of and exposure to these devices is the best solution available. I would recommend turning your phone on airplane mode when not using it or simply turning it off when not in use. I know, it's a scary thought, but we will survive. I would also stop using Bluetooth headphones and stop using Bluetooth while driving in your vehicle. There are also companies producing devices which are supposed to be able to block or absorb the EMFs emitted by our devices. Do your research and see what works for you. Probably one of the most important steps to take is to stop falling asleep with your phone or next to your laptop. I also started unplugging my Wi-Fi at night to protect myself from unnecessary exposure while I'm sleeping. The exposure to these devices and the radio frequency radiation they emit has the potential to disturb your sleep and create stress. This can cause an overall decline in the body's ability to heal and repair at night. When it comes to your home or office, I recommend rewiring as much as possible using Ethernet cables for your desktop or laptop. This will allow you to remove Wi-Fi if you choose and drastically decrease your exposure. There are even options available to use Ethernet connections on your cell phone. There are also similar concerns regarding the smart meters which have been rolled out around the US. Do some research and find out if you can opt out of a smart meter in favor of an analog meter. Remember what I said about the difference between 5G and previous technologies? Once it's rolled out, you will not be able to avoid it while in public. No matter what you do in your house or with your own phone, if 5G is everywhere, there will be no way to opt out. I have seen researchers working on devices that could protect you in public by either repelling or absorbing the EMFs, and others have suggested clothing that can defend you, but for the moment, none of these seem adequate to protect you from the coming 5G smart grid. So after spending the last year diving deep into this topic, interviewing experts, and networking with other researchers, I have no doubt that 5G is being promoted under false pretenses.
We won the race in 4G, and that's why all the innovation happens here in the United States. We've got 30 trials here in the United States, but China's got 100 trials going on this year. Japan and Korea are really racing to get it done for their Olympic commitments.
Just like the Greeks bearing false gifts to the people of Troy, government officials and the big wireless industry are promising the people that 5G is a gift too good to pass up. As we have shown, there are numerous valid reasons to oppose the 5G rollout. Whether it's concerns about health, privacy, local power, or the environment, the government and the wireless industry need to answer our questions. Another thing, where's the media been during all of this? If I could dig up this information and gather these sources with my limited skills and time, why didn't the corporate media identify and report on the concerns about 5G?
Thanks again for having me.
Why did the New York Times and other compliant media outlets insinuate that opponents of 5G are simply victims of Russian disinformation? Instead of listening to the researchers speaking up and the people pushing back, the media stood silent. So all this begs the question, would consumers be so quick to embrace cell phones, Wi-Fi, and 5G if the wireless industry and their partners in government hadn't silenced critics and corrupted the science? If the public knew this information, would that change their minds? Does it change yours?
The cold hard truth is that we have willingly accepted this technology. Yes, we have been lied to by the people we thought we could trust, but at the end of the day, the power is in our hands. We get to decide whether we surround ourselves with devices that threaten our privacy and our health.
We must take responsibility for our own actions and remember to be skeptical of promises of convenience and utopia. As the saying goes, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Thank you for watching.